Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 19 of the Shiny Developer Series. My name is Eric Nance, and I am so happy that you joined me for this episode. This one's an exciting one because you've heard me say in previous episodes that if you're getting into Shiny and you're trying to level up your skill set, this is really one of the best times to be doing it. You've heard some excellent guests in our previous episodes that have been authoring some great materials on leveling up your Shiny skills. And the guest today is on that same thread, so to speak, and it is none other than RStudio's chief scientist, Hadley Wickham, the author of the soon to be published Mastering Shiny. In this episode, you're going to hear us talk about the origins of Shiny from his perspective and get some of his advice for just starting out with Shiny. And for those that are already familiar with Shiny, we're going to talk about some great lessons with debugging, how to level up your skills, and best practices for seeking help and contributing to the Shiny community. Well, let's not wait any longer. It is a real thrill to share with you our interview with Hadley Wickham. Well, hello, friends, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Shiny Developer Series. And I am absolutely thrilled to welcome for my guest of this episode, Chief Scientist at RStudio, Architect of the Tidyverse, and many other accolades that you probably know about. I'd like to welcome Hadley Wickham to the Shiny Developer Series. So, Hadley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric.
Absolutely. So, certainly many in the community, I alluded to it earlier, know you best of your contributions to the Tidyverse and many contributions before that. But not many might know about your involvement with the early days of designing Shiny. So first, maybe in your own words, why do you think Shiny is so important in the art ecosystem? And then maybe you could elaborate a bit on how you were involved with the early days of Shiny development.
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly where this fit in the sequence of of Shiny development, but I remember Joe and I were in San Francisco together, and we visited a bunch of kind of like big internet companies like Airbnb and Pinterest and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that came up kind of again and again with our discussions with data scientists is how like the struggles of like turning what the data scientists were kind of working on into like dashboards that other people in the company could use. And a very common pattern, at the time, and I think it still exists today, is that the data scientists would like do the thing, and then they would turn it over to the web development team to make the dashboard. And then there's a lot of back and forth explaining what everything means and how it's supposed to work, and it takes a long time to get on the web development team schedule. And like 6 months later, you finally get the dashboard, and then by the time it's up, like it's basically out of date
Yes.
already. And
Yes.
this is kind of coming up a very common struggle a lot amongst lots of people. And I think that really um, that kind of really drove the need for Shiny. Like, how could we give our developers the ability to create, compelling web applications that they can then use to surface what they've been working on?
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, that's great to hear that backstory. And certainly, I mean, for me personally, it's been a huge revolution in my workflow, and it's enabled so many opportunities that, as you alluded to before that, we would always have to hand off these different stages of the analysis to another team, and there might be, gaps in timing, gaps in understanding. But now, with the data scientist or statistician involved in that end-to-end process of developing these applications, it's been a huge win in collaboration across multiple industries. And you even alluded to the book, which we'll get to, but my industry of life sciences is one of the biggest customers of Shiny.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
certainly, we even had Joe Chang give a keynote at our first R and Pharma conference, and he was genuinely surprised by all the workflows we were fitting Shiny in. So we are very much appreciative of that. Yep.
We've also had, I know we've had like at least two people have like thanked Joe and said like, you've saved me like several $100,000.
Oh,
We
absolutely.
were like, we were like looking at hiring a company to do this, and I just started playing around with Shiny, and then like over a weekend, I like created the app, the basic app that we needed. It's very
Yeah,
cool.
it's truly amazing. Yeah, both the time and the money, and frankly, the collaboration enhancements are just immeasurable in my book. Speaking
Yeah.
of, yeah, so speaking of books, I was, of course, extremely excited when I heard that you were authoring Mastering Shiny. So maybe you could tell us a bit about the backstory and what inspired you to author the book.
Yeah, so I guess Joe is one of the victims of my book writing advice, which is like writing a book is, I think it's quite simple. Like all you need to do to write a book is like write for like an hour or two every morning. And
Hmm,
that's the secret to how I've written so many books like that. Like that's all you need to do.
interesting.
It turns out that that advice, like I've given it to a number of people and no one has managed to use it successfully. Um, because I think like the writing for an hour every, writing for an hour or two every morning is actually the hard part, and it's like this is something like clearly that I've internalized that allows me to do that, which I don't know how to put into words. So Joe had actually been working on mastering Shiny for I don't know like a year or two
Mm.
maybe, and I was just like really just having a really hard time of it, and I just thought like I'd love to help him out, love to learn more about Shiny and how it all works.
Mm.
And I, had a kind of an open slot in my book writing schedule and thought it would be
Oh.
kind of fun to tackle it.
Wow, that's certainly an interesting set of circumstances, but it's also maybe a unique time for you where you're writing about a concept or a package here or a workflow that certainly, like we alluded to, you've been involved in kind of the early genesis of it, but it sounds like you were learning more about it as you were writing the book, and that's pretty fascinating as well. It's a
Yeah.
great way to learn.
The other thing I really like about it is like compared to Alpha Data Science, like if there's any like when I'm writing about something in Alpha Data Science and it just feels like annoying or hard to use, I feel like I have to stop writing and then go and fix that little thing. Whereas with Shiny, like it's
Yeah.
someone else's responsibility. So I can just kind of write about it and say, this is like a little bit of a rough edge, not a big deal. Just work around it by doing this. Which was, I've also filed a bunch of issues and did a number of little pull requests to Shiny, but just nice to have that to kind of write it. It is nice to like write about someone else's work, and just that distance is I don't know. I found that really enjoyable in the writing process.
Yeah, I did notice some activity in the issue trackers for not only Shiny, but also some of the extension packages like Shiny Test and others. So I knew you were definitely learning and seeing some issues along the way. So that's great to have that
Yeah,
collaborative development on multiple fronts. And you alluded to earlier, obviously, your previous efforts in authoring, like, of course, R for Data Science and Advanced R. And as I've been reading Mastering Shiny in the early web form, I have seen themes, at least from my opinion, where you're taking learnings or concepts from like how an R for Data Science is really about the analytical workflow, the data science pipeline, and then from advanced R, it is certainly coming from an engineering, going inside R, how it works perspective. So, how do you think something like Shiny blends those two different frameworks together, in your opinion?
yeah. I mean, Shiny. I think. I mean, I kind of think about like there's at least I sort of bucket it in my mind a little bit differently to you. Like I think of
Okay.
advanced R as being about like programming.
Okay.
Like how do you like write like how does R work as a programming language and how do you do stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got like R packages, which is more about like software engineering. Like
Ah,
how do
good
you
point.
write
Mm-hmm.
big like big bodies of code that like work and maintainable and can kind of grow over a long period of time. And
Sure.
then you've kind of got the data science side, and like Shiny kind of touches on all of them. Like you're using Shiny primarily to do data analysis. You've got to learn about this new like programming framework of
Mm-hmm.
reactivity, and then you've also got like, because Shiny has been so incredibly successful, people are like writing bigger and bigger apps. And
Yes.
then so you also need to learn like a little bit of software engineering so that as your app gets bigger, it hopefully like the pace of development stays constant. Hopefully, maybe if you're lucky, it actually increases as you get better at it,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like decreasing over time, which I think is the big like if you're like working on a coding project and it just gets like slower and slower and slower to do anything over time, I think that's a sign that there's like something wrong with your kind of software engineering process. And that's kind of like one of the things we see a lot in with Shiny apps, like people make these incredible apps, like we've all been surprised by like how far that people have been able to go to make these really useful apps. And then we look at the code and we're like, oh my God, like what are you doing? That's which is not, it's not like the fault of the like it's like a testament to like you don't know that much about software engineering and you've created
Yes.
this incredibly useful thing. But it's really difficult for us to kind of look at it and say, like, this is what you need to improve. Because it's like, you need to like go back to kind of step one. And so that's hopefully like one of the goals of this book is to give people those skills so that you can start off with a simple app, and it gets more and more featureful and complicated over time, but it doesn't become this kind of like unmaintainable nightmare where like you don't understand like whether your change where the one reactive ends up firing 50 other things. What's going wrong?
Yeah, I can. I'm certainly laughing from past experience. So I was one of the early adopters of Shiny, and my first, I would say, major app. It was exactly the trap that you just alluded to. I built all these different things together, and this was even before modules became a thing, which I'm sure I'll
Yeah,
hit on a little bit.
yeah,
And trying to network all that together is just a nightmare. But more importantly, I could not instill like what my philosophy was to other collaborators or frankly even the future me. So
yeah,
it's certainly a
yeah,
lot of these principles that don't come natural right away, but
yeah.
once you adhere to them, it's a better product and it's a better experience for sure. So we can all sympathize with those things.
Yeah, and like I don't want to like you don't want to feel anyone to feel bad about like the quality of their code because like
Oh,
the
sure.
only way you can write good code is to write like a lot of bad code, and that's exactly what I have done.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. I remember you said
just
that in one of
hopefully
your
just
previous presentations. Exactly. Yep.
hopefully we can just skip you a few steps so you get into good code without going quite down quite so many dead ends.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, let's maybe dive into a little bit of the structure of the book. And one theme I want to touch on first is you do a great job of talking about, what are the best ways to get started with Shiny. Certainly, there are resources about it, but it's great to kind of see a kind of recipe-driven approach to how you create your first app. But my question to you is, as somebody who's getting involved with Shiny maybe for the first time or have basic familiarity with it, what are some of the expectations you think users should have before they embark on this journey as compared to maybe getting into, say, the Tidyverse analytical workflow or things like that, in your opinion?
I think probably like the two things to me, the two biggest differences are probably like you're going to have to learn reactivity, which
Mm-hmm.
is like this fundamentally different programming model. And like it absolutely takes a while to get your head around it.
Yes.
Like I still, things still surprise me and I have to like do little experiments or just ask Joe why it works that way.
Sure.
Um, and then I think the other part of it, which is another area where you can just like there's just so much to learn is like user interface development. Like how do you actually make an app that other people who are not experts can use effectively?
Right.
And I don't get into the book at all because that's just this huge topic, but
Yes.
really really important. And but thinking about that and learning a little bit about that, I think will really helps make your apps more effective.
Yeah, it's just interesting to see the different mindsets that come into play here, and yeah, there are definitely what's great about this time in like learning Shiny is that there's lots of great resources now that are hitting different themes even in more detail if you need to dive into those worlds. So,
Yeah.
actually, with respect to user interfaces, David Grandjean is authoring the
Hmm.
Outstanding Shiny UI, so that's a great place to go if you need to get into nuts and bolts of that alone. But when I first started Shiny, the only resource we really had was the Google mailing list where Joe and others are frequent, and that's how we were trying to learn. So it's a much different
Yeah.
time now. And another part of the book that I was really excited to see as I've been adopting more of the Tidyverse related packages in a lot of my work, but including my Shiny app work, is how we can leverage tidy evaluation in developing your backend Shiny code. And you touch on a couple of great concepts that I didn't really articulate well in my head before is that within tidy evaluation, you have these constructs of n for e and v variables, and then these more of the data variables. So maybe you could elaborate a bit more to our audience what that means and how that fits into like using tidy evaluation with Shiny.
Yeah, I mean, so tidy evaluation, I think, has had a lot of ups and downs in its history. I think like 2 years ago, maybe someone posted on RStudio community saying like, is tidy evaluation destroying the Tidyverse?
Oh, I saw that one.
Uh,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think part of the challenge was like it was so obvious to us like the theory behind tidy evaluation was kind
Mm-hmm.
of correct and gave us a lot of power, but it's taken us a very long time to kind of crisply explain like what do you need to know to actually learn it and to use it.
Sure.
And I think what it's come down to now, I think what kind of captures why it is so difficult at first is this idea like we use the word variable to mean two different things. And until you kind of disentangle those in your head, it's really difficult to use tidy evaluation because you don't have like quite the right like hooks in your brain to hang things off of.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically the idea that like in R, you've got like this, we use variable to mean two different things. We use like a data frame variable that's like, you know, in the iris data frame, there's a variable called species. And we also use it to talk about kind of like objects that exist in environments in R. Like the iris data frame is a variable in the the datasets package, for
Right.
example. You
Right.
know, and the thing that I think makes tidy evaluation kind of challenging is now you've got this like abstraction. You've got the name of a data frame variable stored in an environment variable. And first of all, like that, like until you've like separated the two types of variable, like that sentence doesn't even make sense, right? You've got a variable that's stored in another variable. Like what does that even mean? And it's that indirection, like that's really at the heart of tidy evaluation. I think that being able to capture like this is the name of a variable, a
Mm-hmm.
data variable. I'm going to put it in an environment variable, and later on, I'm going to use it in the context where it's going to be a data variable again.
Yes.
Um, and so I think, I mean, my hope is like that now, like once you get that kind of idea in your head, and then the problem of the great thing about tidy evaluation, like from a user perspective, is that you can use data variables and environment variables interchangeably. And that's that's like when you're subsetting a data frame, you can just say species equals, you don't have to say iris $species.
Right. Right.
But it's that ambiguity that then makes it hard to program with. And the basic idea is like once you've identified what's a data variable, what's an environment variable, you can now use these pronouns called .data and .env to kind of be explicit about where things are coming from. And then, after that, I think things just kind of relatively naturally fall out. At least for the case of using it in Shiny apps, which is a slightly simpler case than all of the general possible cases you might want to use it.
Right. And it reminds me back when I was taking one of your workshops at RStudio Conf, it was about a couple of years ago when you were doing an advanced Tidyverse kind of workshop. And when you were talking about tidy evaluation, at that time, it didn't really click with me, this concept of the different types of variables. But now, after reading this chapter, it once you start there, like if you start there, then you're able to decompose it successfully. It becomes much easier to harness than maybe when I first tried it a couple of years ago. So I know you, like you alluded to, you've learned a lot along the way, you and others on the team, but I
Yeah.
think it really shows in how you've authored the material here. And I think it's a great win for Shiny authors to leverage these concepts effectively, especially if you have like back-end code that's like doing data processing, data manipulation, and you have functions that are already doing this kind of thing. You don't have to like mentally shift to a different paradigm
Yeah.
if you want to use it again. So like I said, that was extremely exciting for me to see that.
Yeah, it's great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, am I an expert at it? Certainly not yet, but I know enough to be dangerous, as they say. So it's been exciting to learn about that. And the other concept you alluded to that I think is the most fundamental in Shiny, in my humble opinion, of course, is reactivity. It's really what distinguishes it from a regular R kind of analytical workflow here. And so, what's your opinion? You kind of allude to it a little bit on some of the more challenging aspects of reactivity that the users need to grasp across the different maybe spectrums of experience that someone might have with Shiny.
Yeah, I think think reactivity is kind of challenging because like when you start using it like very simply and very initially, it's it's like magic, but it just works, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't like think, you don't build up like a mental model of what's happening. Just your like outputs update automatically as your inputs change. And if you've never really thought about it, like that, just it just feels like that's how, like that's just obviously how the world should work. But like as your app starts to get more complicated, you need to start to kind of make that reactivity maybe like a little bit conditional. You only want to update this thing if that thing is true. It's very easy like you to kind of get yourself into the state where you do have no idea what's going wrong, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just magic, and you're just like kind of randomly changing things in the hope that that'll fix your app. And I think at that point, like then you really have to sit down and like say, well, now I'm going to spend a little time like really trying to understand the theory. And that's when I think like starting to think about like the reactive graph and the arrows connect, that's like that's what I picture in my head is like when I'm looking at a show is how do all of these things connect together?
Right.
And
Right.
like the clearer you can make that, both in terms of like your internal mental model and how easily you can see that by reading the code, I think that the better you become as a Shiny developer.
Yeah, it's definitely a learning journey for sure. And lots of things I learned the hard way, especially as you start mixing the concepts like reactives and observers and trying to figure out, okay, where do things launch at what point? And there are nice tooling available that you allude to in the book as well on drawing that kind of reactive flow, even in your head, kind of on paper at first, but then verifying are
Yeah,
your assumptions actually correct with things like the React log package that
yeah,
Slicky has been offering. So it's definitely getting easier to find those issues, but boy, that's the biggest debugging nightmare sometimes. It's not so much as an error, but it's like it's not firing at the exact
yeah.
time I want it. So that can be a frustrating experience. But I think with experience, we experience in reactivity, it hopefully gets a bit smoother.
I think that the other mistake that's like one of the most common mistakes I see people doing is putting too much like non-reactive code in the server function. Like if you've got to do like a lot of complicated, like data cleaning or data analysis that doesn't
Right.
actually depend on reactivity, you're better off like pulling that out into a separate function so that your server app almost becomes like just the connections in the reactive graph.
Yes.
And then like the more you can kind of condense that down and make it like a very crisp declaration of the reactive graph, the easier it is to understand what's going on.
Yeah, I wish I could mark like 100 stars next to that one comment because too many times I see people put these absolutely massive server files and inside reactives. It's so hard to decompose like where the problem really resides. Where if you can factor out that back end logic and dedicated functions, then it's much easier to just debug at those points when you need it, but then to rule out if that's a problem or not. And I think that's another thing that comes through experience and more, like you said, kind of the software engineering principles. But certainly when I started with Shiny, it wasn't natural yet. But now the value of decomposing and making things more articulate in your intention of where you want to use backend logic and make your server files, whether they're in modules or in the overall server
Yeah,
construct, more easier to understand and easier to reason with, it can only lead to better things.
yeah, yeah. And then those skills, like they transfer to basically any place you're writing code. Like the better you can get at kind of extracting out like a clear, concise idea and like isolating that so you can think about it separately. The better a programmer you become.
Yeah, right, right. And on that thread of kind of like learning and maybe getting help along the way, I was again very excited to see that you have a great section in the book about how you can effectively get help with Shiny. And this is where the concept of reproducible examples come into huge play here. Now,
Hmm.
for me personally, Shiny has always been one of the more challenging areas to develop a reprex for. But maybe you could touch on, if you don't mind, maybe on top of what you're authoring in the book for reprexes, what additional advice do you have for Shiny developers to help create effective reprexes when they're facing issues with, say, reactivity or anything like that?
Yeah, I think just to emphasize that, like to me, like the reprex is the tool that I use. Like if there's a problem,
Mm-hmm.
you want to like isolate, like figure out exactly where the problem is.
Yes.
And like the more you can kind of like throw stuff away to get to like the heart of the problem, the easier it is going to be to figure out like what's gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And like as the author of the app, like you are more suited, you can do that more easily than anyone else because you kind of know what's going on. Whereas
Sure.
if you want someone to help you and then you give them like 1,000 lines of code and like one of those lines is a problem, like it's really difficult to figure out what's going on. And
Absolutely.
it's going to be frustrating when you make your first reprex. Like it's kind of slow and annoying, but it's like it's absolutely a skill. You get better at it over time, and then just it makes it easier for other people to get help you. And then you discover like 90% of the time when you make a minimal reprex, you're like, oh, now I know what the problem is. Like it's obvious now.
Right.
Like you don't need any like sophisticated programming knowledge. Like once you've got down to the heart of the problem to recognize like what's gone wrong. And that's why like everything we do, like always, whenever we have a problem, it always starts with a reprex and trying to like narrow it down to the smallest amount of code. And I think like as you get better at it, I think that that's something I now kind of like. It's kind of fun. Like it's definitely better when people come up with a minimal reprex themselves, but it is something like I enjoy. Like here's 100 lines of code. Now I'm going to get it down to like the 3 lines of code that actually illustrate the problem. And that's kind of like a fun little game.
Yeah, the learning journey that I'm on is as I develop these apps with say 5, 10, maybe 20 modules inside, and they're all kind of networking with each other, passing things back and forth. That when something goes wrong in one of them, how I can isolate it to like maybe that one specific module, but find the best way to do a reprex that cuts off the fluff that it doesn't need
Yeah.
if I want to post to say RStudio community or somewhere else. And admittedly, that's the part I'm probably the weakest in because when I deal with issues at Shiny at my day job, people usually go to me for the Shiny questions. So I don't have
Yeah.
first the
Yeah.
expertise we're trying to develop, but then if I want to get help, I got to figure out how to decompose a lot of that other unnecessary logic that
Yeah.
isn't really impacting the problem. So I'm gonna certainly be practicing that, but that's a journey I'm on currently.
But I think that also helps you, like as you do that more, like you'll get a better sense for like when you start designing something, like there's a little voice in the back of your head, like, am I going to be able to like debug this later? And like, could I make the design a little simpler? There's a
Right.
lot, I forget where this comes from, but there's a kind of a saying like, it's always harder to debug code than to write code.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
So if you write code that is like you at your smartest, you're not going to be smart enough to debug it. So you have to like, you can't like write code at the peak of your abilities because you won't be able to debug it. You've always got to like kind of claw it back a little bit. So if something goes wrong, there's a little intellectual headroom for you to deal with it.
Yeah, that I had a situation with a colleague yesterday. We were debugging a Shiny issue, and I think he was very smart in how we got to that piece, but then trying to decompose why something wasn't firing. Yeah, we ran into all sorts of hurdles, and I think we walked into that one whether we liked it or not. So a couple more things I wanted to touch on is from a developer perspective, what we're seeing now, especially in the industries that we see Shiny prevalent in, is that we're often working with multiple teammates on even a single Shiny app as they get bigger complexity, may have
Yeah.
different parts of the logic that are more for like ingesting data versus doing some analytical workflow, maybe with HPC technology. And this actually reminds me of the example that you outlined in the module book where I was networking all this different
Yeah.
workflow together. And in that case, I was the sole developer, but now sometimes I got multiple members helping me. But maybe you could let us know from your experience in, developing the tidyverse of your team at RStudio, maybe what are some thoughts about enhancing the developer type of collaboration as you're engineering these more complex apps that maybe you could talk to us about?
Yeah. I think there are two things that feel particularly important to me. The one is like trying to like decompose things as much as
Mm-hmm.
possible and then just having a few kind of connection points between them so that people can work like largely independently on different parts at the same time, and
Mm-hmm.
that they're only connected between these like few ways, so it's relatively easy to like iterate on one thing and not break everything else. And that's, I mean, that is, I don't know, that's like maybe the hardest kind of software engineering skill,
Yeah.
like figuring out how to decompose things into independent pieces.
Right.
And you do it wrong for a long time, and then it, slowly you get better at it. And I don't know. I wish there were some shortcuts, but I don't know them.
Yeah, I don't know them either. I know for me, when I knew an app was probably going to be bigger than I initially anticipated, I would even use modules, even in the case where maybe that module is called once, because that's still a
Yeah.
separate piece of code that another developer could work on, and I could work on something different, but then I could be the one that kind of brings it all together, and we can, yeah, do that in parallel. That's certainly been a huge win for me.
I think the other part is like really kind of investing in shared convention so that you can like,
Yeah.
well, like most of the time you stay in kind of, you can, you stay in your lane. But if you do need to like touch someone else's code, like it's very natural. Like it feels like, it's your code. It uses the same style. It uses the same conventions. You can kind of drop in and, basically understand how it works.
Right.
And I think that's something that we have kind of, I think that in the Tidyverse team, like that's the things we spend the most time kind of discussing are those like big picture design ideas. So that while by and large everyone kind of maintains their own set of packages, anyone can kind of like jump in and easily make a fix. They know where the tests live. They know what the policies around naming things are. They know how to document. They know what the basic style is, and it just makes it much easier to be collaborative. Like you don't want to force that kind of tight interlinking where people have to be constantly kind of communicating back and forth in order to
Mm.
get anything done.
Mm-hmm.
But when people do want to collaborate, it's just easy. It all feels like one. It all feels like the code has all been written by like one person,
Yes.
um, even if you might have forgotten how some of the code works.
And that probably was my weaker area in a recent project is we had the whole like decomposing of these different distinct components, but then they took a completely different approach architecturally than what I would do in certain parts of the app. And it was difficult to kind of reconcile when I brought all that together to understand what their reason is for that kind of logic and their conventions on like variable, derivations and everything. So that's something I'm going to try to do in the future too, is have kind of a unified, developer kind of guideline, developer syntax that we all can follow through, because it is more difficult to debug when it's written from a completely different perspective than what you're used to.
Yeah. And I find that the other thing I've been trying to do more of lately is when I make like a small breaking change in a package, I will do
Mm-hmm.
pull requests to all of the packages that it affects.
Ah,
And
yes.
that's been really interesting. I think that's been really useful at building like my empathy with developers, because like I'm also like, as well as breaking it, I'm also doing fixing. But it's also
Right.
just it's really useful to see like kind of what are the things that are working well, like what are the things that we've done well about like explaining how to develop packages, and what are the things that we could do better at, because there's some packages that are just really hard for me to fix because I'm like, I don't know where the light switch is, kind of. And that just
Right.
makes it like very difficult to like quickly figure out like what the problem is, and fix it.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. Like I said, I'm going to take a lot of those learnings as I develop more Shiny apps in the future. The other thread I wanted to hit on is more of the community aspect. So as we've seen the Tidyverse gain popularity and gain traction in the R ecosystem, you have done an excellent job with your colleagues at RStudio on making the onboarding of getting involved with the Tidyverse easier. I think of after the previous RStudio conferences having like the Tidyverse developer days where we all could get together and share ideas on fixing issues. But the Shiny community, I think, is also gaining a lot of traction as well. So I'm just wondering, do you have advice to those maybe getting involved with Shiny on ways they might be able to connect with others in the Shiny community and learning from each other from your perspective?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think Shiny, yeah, there's sort of a, I think one thing that's different with Shiny is like how quickly it feels to me like the ecosystem of packages around Shiny has grown. Like,
Absolutely.
there's like, you know, dozens, from, more than like dozens, 50, 60 packages that like more that even that they kind of build on Shiny in some way.
Yeah, you should see the description file of one of my bigger apps. That probably has like 45 packages, and more than half of them are Shiny related. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that somehow that makes it a little like the tidyverse. There's sort of a much kind of like stronger like locus of control that's kind of centered like around my team.
Mm, mm-hmm.
Whereas I think Shiny is much more diffuse. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that yeah, that's sort of interesting, and I don't know what like probably ask what we could what our studio we could be doing to kind of bring that community together and to keep people talking to each other. Discoverability pretty quickly becomes a problem. Like maybe there is a package out there that will really help you solve the problem you're working on, but how the heck do you find it? And
Yeah.
on the kind of flip side, like as a package developer, like what should you be doing to market your work? Since you've put all this time and effort into it, how do you help people actually discover it so it can help them?
Yeah, it's a big issue, but I'm certainly doing my part with things like this developer series to highlight some of these. But certainly, I'm only one person, so hopefully others will be along that journey. But I know I benefited from the networking I've gone to various conferences that I've maybe they're industry specific, but also just putting things out there of like example apps and certainly what RStudio has done with the Shiny contest has been a huge benefit
Yeah.
as well. So you got to see how people are blending these different other packages together. Then you can kind of see unified themes on ones that are appearing maybe more common than others, and you can kind of grok then what are the ones that you think you should be investing in. But it is, I won't say a wild west, but there can be a bit of variation in what these packages are doing. So you definitely need to have a more honed in on perspective and make sure it's useful for the project you have. But from my experiences, the community has been very welcoming. They love when
Yeah.
we report issues. They love when we can contribute pull requests to enhance a package. And I've certainly done that for a few of them. So I hope it just grows over time. But I think it's an exciting journey to be on for sure.
Yeah, and I found that like there are a few packages they talk about in the book, and basically whenever I start using a package, I discover like a lot of little things that kind of bug me, and some of them sparse like 10 issues or something, and the
Sure.
developers were like really happy to kind of dig in and fix them, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I know that in now I'm in a particular industry where I have to keep a lot of things close to the vest, so to speak. But as we start to build examples that mimic real world usage, that's when we get the opportunity to do more networking with other developers and share our ideas and maybe for future enhancements. And certainly, yeah, I think we all can benefit from that. So I guess to kind of wrap things up here, the book is still in progress, but what's your expectations for when it will be finished and in the hands of in paper form?
So the goal is to like finish it next by the end. Well, the goal was to finish it today, but I did not make that goal. So
Oh,
the
today,
the
really?
goal is to finish it
Oh.
next Friday. So that basically means like I'm kind of done with the all the big picture writing.
Okay.
Then it goes over to O'Reilly for all like they start assembling the book and making sure all the images are the right size and do a bunch of proofreading and stuff. So I think it's like probably under 6 months away
Hmm.
now. Hopefully, I think probably 3 to 6 months away. I would imagine before you can like get a physical book in your hand,
Sure, sure.
and then the content on the website is basically done. So
Yeah,
if
well,
you if you've been waiting to start reading it until it's finished, wait no longer.
well, I'm one of those people. I'm an early reader, so to speak. So it's been great to see the evolution of the different sections in place. And yeah, it's been, I mean, as a kind of an aside, the open publishing model that started with things like R4DS has been so helpful to the R community. So I'm so thankful that you followed that same principle here, so we could kind of see the development in action and
Yeah,
comment on ideas as you were reaching out to the community on authoring certain sections. I know you would reach out on Twitter sometimes and say, "Hey, I'm offering this section.
yeah.
Any advice?" So that's really been benefiting everybody, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I love it too because if you otherwise if you just sit down to write a book and you get kind of no feedback, it's hard. It's so hard to keep your motivation high. And like even when people are reporting problems or complaining about things, it's still like a positive to me because at least like they read it and they cared enough about it to complain, and that like keeps me keeps me motivated. So it's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, getting that feedback so helpful. So I guess one last kind of question to the Shiny audience is: do you have some last bit of advice on top of course, reading Mastering Shiny of how users can kind of level up their skills as they start to transition from like that basic familiarity
Yeah.
to developing more complex, applications?
I think that the best advice I can give is to make sure that you are setting aside time to kind of improve like the quality of your app, like not so that the what it might do stays exactly the same, but
Mm-hmm.
the quality of your code increases. And like making sure that like you understand why that's important because it increases it allows you to keep the pace of development up over time, and then also selling it to like your boss or whoever, like I'm going to be working on this. There's not going to be any like visible outputs, but the ease at which I can maintain this is going to improve, and my software engineering skills are going to improve. And if you can like regularly invest in your programming skills and your software engineering skills, that's just that's something that compounds over time, and you get better and better and better.
Yeah, well, that's an excellent way to wrap that piece of it up. In closing, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, either about the book or about anything else, what's the best way they can get a hold of you?
Twitter and
Okay.
GitHub.
Yep, that's certainly where I've been interacting with you a
Yep.
lot. Yep, that's great. Well, Hadley, again, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. Again, on behalf of the overall Shiny community, we are so excited to see your efforts and helping us on the journey of learning Shiny with this excellent resource. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about you in this space even in the future. So,
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
all right, great to talk with you, Hadley. And we'll be
Bye.
back right after this. Yep. Well, that was extremely exciting to hear what Hadley has in store for us with this excellent resource and the advice that he gave us from his wealth of experience with obviously authoring the Tidyverse related packages and coming at this from the practitioner standpoint and this software development mindset. It's just such a great time to be learning about these concepts in Shiny because, as I alluded to in the talk, a lot of these resources simply were not around when I first started with Shiny. So you're coming at this at a great time if you're kind of new to this journey. So if you want to hear more and be up to date with the great community of Shiny, certainly the best way to get in touch is to subscribe to this very YouTube channel. Use the little links below. And all the resources that are mentioned in each of our episodes is posted on our official website of shinydevseries.com. And also keep an eye on RStudio community. We'll have some posts there in the near future as these episodes are being published. And I have lots of plans for future guests this year, and you'll be hearing about that across all the spectrums of Shiny development, and it'll be really exciting. And of course, I'm going to be continuing my live streaming efforts, so I kind of learn out loud with all of you and try some fun projects. And certainly, I might do some more on that little fun racing initiative I've been a part of. So, okay, so once again, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm on Twitter at the Rcast. And also, like I said, head to shinydevseries.com. You'll have a contact page that you can file your request to as well, and I'll be glad to talk with all of you. All right, so that's going to wrap up this episode of the Shiny Developer Series, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.